On August 23, 1912, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar vanished during a family fishing trip to Swayze Lake in Louisiana. He was playing near the tent one moment and gone the next. His parents searched frantically. The lake was dragged. They checked everything. But Bobby was nowhere to be found. 8 months later, a child was discovered hundreds of miles away in Mississippi. The town of Opelousas erupted in celebration. Newspapers called it a miracle. The Dunbars wept with joy as they brought their son home. But 90 years later, a DNA test would reveal a truth so devastating. It would destroy everything two families believed about that day. The boy who came home wasn't Bobby Dunbar at all. So whose child did the Dunbars raise? And what really happened to Bobby on that August day in 1912? Before we dive into this haunting story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious true crime cases that have shaped history. Opelousas, Louisiana, 1912. A time when America was still finding its footing in a new century, when electricity was a luxury, and when a family's reputation meant everything. Percy Dunbar was the kind of man people respected. A real estate and insurance man with a sharp mind for business and an even sharper sense of propriety. He wore his success quietly but confidently, the way a man does when he's earned every dollar through honest work and careful planning. His wife, Leslie, was everything a woman of her station should be. Well-dressed, well-spoken, devoted to her family. Together, they represented the ideal of Southern respectability in a small Louisiana town where everyone knew everyone, and reputations were built over generations. Their home on the tree-lined streets of Opelousas was filled with the sounds of childhood. 2 boys. The eldest was Robert Clarence Dunbar, though everyone called him Bobby. Born on May 23, 1908, Bobby was 4 years old that summer. 4 years of watching him grow from a helpless infant into a sturdy little boy with personality and opinions of his own. The postcards they would later distribute described him in careful detail. Large round blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him, hair that was light but beginning to darken as he grew, a complexion very fair with rosy cheeks that flushed when he ran and played. He was well developed for his age, stout but not fat, the kind of healthy child that made mothers smile and fathers proud. On his left foot, the big toe bore a scar from a burn he'd received as a baby. On his neck, a small mole. These details seemed insignificant then. They would become everything later. Bobby's younger brother, Alonzo, was still a toddler, too young to remember much of what would happen. But Bobby was old enough to form memories, old enough to know his mother's voice, his father's face, the feeling of home, or so everyone believed. August in Louisiana is a special kind of brutal. The heat doesn't just warm you, it wraps around you like a wet blanket, pressing down until even breathing feels like work. The humidity transforms the air into something you can almost see, wavering in the distance, distorting reality. For families seeking relief, there was one answer: water. Swayze Lake, a fishing spot in St. Landry Parish, not far from home but far enough to feel like an escape. The Dunbars had been there before. It was the kind of place where families could spend a day in relative comfort, fishing, cooling off in the water, enjoying the break from the oppressive heat of town. On August 23, 1912, Percy and Leslie loaded up their 2 young sons and headed to the lake for what should have been an ordinary summer outing. They set up near the water's edge, watching the boys play, enjoying the rare breeze that came off the lake. The swampy terrain stretched out around them, dense with undergrowth, alive with the sounds of insects and birds. Beautiful in its own wild way, but dangerous if you didn't respect it. Alligators were common in these waters. Everyone knew that. You kept children close. You watched them constantly. The lake itself was deceptive, muddy and dark, hiding sudden drop-offs and treacherous currents beneath a calm surface. Sometime before lunch, Bobby wandered away from the tent. Nobody saw him go. Nobody heard him cry out. One moment he was there, playing near his family, his straw hat perched on his small head. The next moment he was simply gone. At first there was no panic. Children wandered off. They got distracted by butterflies or interesting sticks. You called their name and they came running back, sheepish and giggling. But when Bobby didn't answer his mother's calls, when minutes turned into an hour with no sign of him, the fear began to set in. They searched the immediate area first. Percy and Leslie, their voices growing more desperate with each shout of Bobby's name. Other families camping nearby joined in. They combed through the underbrush, looked behind trees, checked the tent again and again as if Bobby might have somehow returned without anyone noticing. Nothing. A search party formed quickly. Locals who knew the terrain, men with hunting experience who understood how to track through swamps. They found footprints near the lake's edge, small bare feet that led to the water and then disappeared. The terrible, obvious conclusion. Bobby had fallen into Swayze Lake. They dragged the lake. They searched desperately for days. But they found nothing. Then, a day or two after Bobby disappeared, someone found his straw hat some distance from the lake, far enough that it changed everything. Because if Bobby had drowned, why would his hat be so far from the water? Had someone carried him off? Had he been taken? The Dunbars made a decision that would echo through the decades. Bobby hadn't drowned. Bobby had been kidnapped. Percy Dunbar was not a man who accepted defeat. He hired a detective agency and had them print up postcards with Bobby's photograph and physical description. These were mailed to town and county officials from East Texas all the way to Florida. The reward started at $1,000. When that brought no results, the community rallied. The reward grew to $6,000. In 1912, that was the equivalent of about $160,000 today. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. A small boy vanished from a family fishing trip. A desperate family searching for any clue. America was captivated. But as weeks turned into months, the headlines grew less frequent. The search continued, but hope began to fade. 8 months. 240 days. 35 weeks of not knowing. 35 weeks of Leslie waking up and remembering, every single morning, that her son was gone. 35 weeks of Percy following every lead, no matter how unlikely. 35 weeks of little Alonzo growing up without his brother, too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the weight of grief that filled their home. The Dunbars were beginning to accept that they might never know what happened to Bobby. And then, in April of 1913, everything changed. William Cantwell Walters was a traveler by trade and temperament. An itinerant handyman who specialized in tuning and repairing pianos and organs, he moved from town to town in a covered wagon, offering his services wherever there was work. He was from Barnesville, North Carolina, a man in his 30s with no criminal record, known to be quiet and competent at his trade. And for months, he'd been traveling with a young boy. On April 13, 1913, near Columbia, Mississippi, authorities received a tip. A man matching Walter's description had been seen with a child who fit Bobby Dunbar's description. Same age, light hair, blue eyes. The authorities moved quickly. When they caught up with Walters, they found him with a boy who appeared to be about 5 years old. The child looked healthy and well cared for, though his clothes were worn from travel. Walters was calm when they approached him. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply told them the truth as he knew it. The boy wasn't Bobby Dunbar. His name was Charles Bruce Anderson, though everyone called him Bruce. He was the son of Julia Anderson, a woman who worked for Walter's family back in North Carolina. Julia had asked Walters to take Bruce with him on his travels. The boy had been with him for over a year. The authorities didn't believe him. They arrested Walters on the spot and took custody of the child. A telegram was sent to Opelousas, Louisiana. "We found your son." Percy and Leslie Dunbar boarded a train to Mississippi faster than most people could pack a bag. 8 months of agony, 8 months of not knowing, and now this. Their boy was alive. Their boy was coming home. But when they walked into that room and saw the child for the first time, something went wrong. The newspaper accounts of that initial meeting contradict each other so completely that the truth became impossible to determine. One paper reported that the boy immediately recognized his mother, crying out, "Mother!" and reaching his arms up to her. It described Leslie fainting with joy, overwhelmed by the reunion. Another newspaper told a very different story. In that version, the boy woke up crying when he saw the Dunbars. Leslie fell back with a gasp and said words that would haunt the case forever. "I do not know. I am not quite sure." Some reports said the boy called out for his younger brother Alonzo by name. "There's my Bubba, Alonzo." Others said the child merely scowled and showed no recognition whatsoever. Percy himself was quoted as saying the boy's eyes seemed smaller than Bobby's. How could the same event be reported so differently? In 1913, newspapers were competing for readers, and sensational stories sold papers. Accuracy was often sacrificed for drama. But beneath the conflicting reports, one thing seemed clear. The initial reunion was not the joyful, certain recognition that a parent and child should share after 8 months apart. The Dunbars took the boy back to their hotel for the night. Leslie bathed him, examining his body for the identifying marks she knew by heart. And there she found them, or believed she found them. Moles that seemed familiar, scars that looked right. The burn scar on the left toe that Bobby had received as a baby. Though she also noted that some marks she expected weren't there, or weren't quite in the right place. The next morning, Leslie Dunbar declared with absolute certainty. This was Bobby. This was her son. After 8 months of grief, after believing she might never see him again, her boy was coming home. On April 25, 1913, the city of Opelousas threw a party. Bobby Dunbar arrived on a flower-covered fire truck as part of a joyous procession through the courthouse square. Brass bands played. Citizens who had contributed to the reward cheered. A 100-year-old woman who had been 10 years old at the time would later recall. It was a jolly affair. Everybody was happy for the little boy. The nightmare was over. The story had its happy ending. But there was a woman in North Carolina who had a very different version of events. Her name was Julia Anderson, and she was about to turn this miracle into a legal battle that would captivate the nation. Julia Anderson was everything the Dunbars were not. She was poor. She was unmarried. She had given birth to 3 children by 2 different men, none of whom was her husband. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1913, this made her less than respectable. It made her easy to dismiss, easy to judge, but it didn't make her wrong. Julia worked as a domestic, a field hand, doing whatever work she could find to survive. She had known the Walters family for years. William Walters had grown close to her son Bruce, playing with him, caring for him like an uncle might. In February of 1912, according to Julia, Walters asked if he could take Bruce with him for a few days while he visited his sister. Just a few days. Those few days turned into months. Julia would later be vilified for this. How could a mother allow her child to be gone for over a year without reporting him missing? The newspapers would paint her as neglectful, as someone who cared little for her young. But the reality was more complicated and more heartbreaking. Julia was poor. She had no resources, no powerful friends, no access to law enforcement that would take her seriously. When Walters didn't return Bruce after a few days, what could she do? He was traveling constantly. She had no way to track him down. And on some level, she may have believed Bruce was better off with Walters than struggling with her in poverty. When she heard about Bobby Dunbar's disappearance and the massive search, she didn't connect it to her own situation. Why would she? Bruce was with Walters. Bobby Dunbar was a different child entirely. Then William Walters was arrested for kidnapping, and suddenly Julia's world collapsed. The boy they'd found with Walters, the boy the Dunbars were claiming as their son, was her Bruce. She was certain of it. A New Orleans newspaper paid for Julia's trip to Opelousas. It made for good drama, good sales. 2 mothers fighting over the same child. The public ate it up. On May 1st, 1913, Julia Anderson arrived in Louisiana, exhausted from an overnight train ride, probably terrified of what she would find. She was taken to a home in Opelousas where she would attempt to identify the child. 5 boys around Bruce's age were brought in at different times, including the boy the Dunbars had claimed as Bobby. When the child in question entered the room, both he and Julia broke into tears. But these weren't tears of reunion. They were tears of confusion, of fear, of a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Julia looked at the boy. She tried to speak to him. She offered him an orange. The child showed no signs of recognition. He didn't call her mother. He didn't run to her. He seemed frightened. The lawyers in the room refused to tell Julia if this was the boy who had been found with Walters. They watched her struggle, watched her uncertainty grow. Finally, devastated, Julia admitted she didn't know. She couldn't be sure. The test was declared a failure. The newspapers pounced. Headlines screamed about Julia's failure to recognize her own child. The New Orleans Item published a particularly vicious piece titled "Julia Has Forgotten." The article painted her as a coarse, illiterate woman who cared so little for her children that she'd forgotten what her own son looked like. It compared her unfavorably to animals, suggesting that even beasts had better maternal instincts. It implied she was a prostitute, questioned her morals, her intelligence, her worth as a human being. Julia begged for a second chance. The next day, she was allowed to see the boy again, this time in private. She was permitted to undress him, to examine him the way Leslie Dunbar had done. This time, Julia was certain. This was Bruce. This was her son. She knew his body, knew the marks and scars that made him unique. She tried to leave with him, but the damage had already been done. The newspapers had reported her initial uncertainty. Public opinion had turned against her. She was poor, unmarried, morally questionable in the eyes of society. The Dunbars were respected, wealthy, the kind of people you could trust with a child. And the boy himself seemed to prefer the Dunbars. He was living in a nice house now with toys and a pony, sleeping in a comfortable bed. He was being told over and over that he was Bobby Dunbar, that these were his parents, that he was home. A 4-year-old child, confused and frightened, would naturally gravitate toward the stable environment being offered. Julia had no lawyer. She had no money to fight the Dunbars in court. She returned to North Carolina, defeated, leaving the boy behind. But she came back one more time for William Walters' trial. And this time she wasn't alone. William Cantwell Walters faced kidnapping charges in Louisiana. In 1913, kidnapping was a capital offense. He could be sentenced to death for a crime he insisted he didn't commit. Julia Anderson returned to Louisiana to testify at his trial, to tell the court the truth. Bruce was her son, and she had willingly allowed him to travel with Walters. She stood by her friend even as the world turned against them both. And she brought witnesses, dozens of them. Residents of Poplarville, Mississippi, flooded into the courtroom. They had known Walters during his travels through their town. They had seen him with the boy for months before Bobby Dunbar ever disappeared. Their testimony created a timeline that should have been impossible to ignore. Walters and the child had been together since at least October of 1912, 2 months after Bobby Dunbar vanished, but their presence together had been documented even earlier than that. How could Walters have kidnapped Bobby in August if people had seen him with a child matching that description months before? The defense presented affidavits, sworn statements from people across Mississippi and North Carolina who had encountered Walters and the boy during their travels. The evidence suggested that this child, whoever he was, had been with Walters for over a year, exactly as Walters claimed. Walters himself wrote a letter to Percy Dunbar, a last desperate attempt to make him understand. The letter was found decades later in the defense files, and its words are haunting. "I see that you got Bruce, but you have heaped up trouble for yourselves. I had no chance to prove up, but I know by now you have decided you are wrong. It is very likely I will lose my life on account of that. And if I do, the great God will hold you accountable. That boy's mother is Julia Anderson. You ask him and he will tell you. I did not teach him to beg or bum. But inasmuch as you have him, take good care of him. So you have a lost Robert and me a lost Bruce. May God bless my darling boy. Write me if I don't get lynched. I think you will be sad a long time, but hope not too bad." The letter suggests that Walters believed the Dunbars knew they had the wrong child, but were too invested in the story to admit it. Whether that was true is something we'll never know for certain. There was also another letter, found in the defense files, signed only by a Christian woman. This anonymous woman wrote 6 pages laying out point by point why the Dunbars must have the wrong child. Why hadn't pictures of Bobby and Bruce been printed side by side so the public could compare? Why was Julia judged more harshly for her uncertainty than Leslie, when both mothers had initially struggled to recognize the boy. Why were the Dunbars afraid to let anyone interview the child privately? The letter ended with a disturbing observation. It questioned why Leslie Dunbar only became certain after bathing the child and examining his naked body in private, when her initial reaction had been doubt. Despite all this evidence, despite the witnesses, despite the timeline that didn't make sense, the court ruled in favor of the Dunbars. The boy was Bobby Dunbar. William Cantwell Walters was guilty of kidnapping. Walters was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He served his time, though his conviction was later overturned on appeal. The state declined to retry him, citing the excessive costs of the first trial, and he was released. For the rest of his life, he maintained his innocence. When he died in 1945 and was buried in Pueblo, Colorado, his family still believed he had been wrongly convicted. Julia Anderson returned to Poplarville, Mississippi, the town that had supported her when no one else would. The community welcomed her, and she rebuilt her life there. She married, had 7 more children, became a devout Christian, helped found a church, and worked as a nurse and midwife. By all accounts, she lived a good life. But her children would later say that she spoke often of her lost son, the boy who had been taken from her, the child she believed the Dunbars had stolen. Julia Anderson died on February 1, 1940, never knowing if she would be vindicated. She was buried in Ford's Creek Cemetery in Poplarville, taking her grief and her certainty to the grave. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar grew up in Opelousas. He went to school, played with other children, lived what appeared to be a normal childhood. He grew into a man, got married, had 4 children of his own. He worked as a salesman, became a respected member of his community. Family members would later say that he'd been told about the events surrounding his childhood, about the trial and the controversy. His response was always the same. He knew who he was. He was Bobby Dunbar. In 1966, Bobby Dunbar died, and the story should have ended there. A life lived fully, a mystery buried with the past. But in 1999, a woman named Margaret Dunbar Cutright found a box of old newspaper clippings and started asking questions that would tear the story open again. Margaret Dunbar Cutright grew up knowing the family legend. Her grandfather had been kidnapped as a child and miraculously returned. It was a story told at family gatherings, a piece of their history that made them special. Tragic but ultimately triumphant. When she was in 5th grade, her grandmother told her the story in detail for the first time. Margaret was frightened by it, even though it supposedly had a happy ending. There was something about the story that didn't sit right, something unresolved that nagged at her even as a child. In 1999, 33 years after Bobby Dunbar's death, Margaret's father gave her a birthday present, a photo album filled with newspaper clippings from 1912 and 1913. He probably thought it would be a nice way for her to connect with her family history. Instead, it became an obsession. Margaret began reading through the articles, and the more she read, the less the family legend made sense. The newspapers contradicted each other. The details didn't align. And most disturbing of all, there were clear indications that the initial reunion had been uncertain, that even the Dunbars themselves hadn't been sure they had the right child. Margaret was a meticulous researcher. She spent weeks in the reading rooms of the Library of Congress. She traveled to small-town libraries and archives throughout the South. She tracked down court records, defense files, private letters. She contacted the descendants of Julia Anderson and found they had their own family legend, that Julia's son Bruce had been kidnapped by the Dunbars and raised as someone else's child. 2 families, 2 stories. Both couldn't be true. Margaret partnered with Linda Tarver, one of Julia Anderson's granddaughters. Together, they pieced together evidence that suggested the impossible. The Dunbars had raised the wrong child. But Margaret didn't want to believe it. She loved her family. She loved the man she'd known as her grandfather. She wanted to prove that he really was Bobby Dunbar, that the family legend was true. There was only one way to know for certain: DNA testing. In 2004, an Associated Press reporter approached the family about the story. The timing was right, the technology was available, and Bob Dunbar Jr., Bobby Dunbar's son, agreed to undergo testing. The test was simple in concept but devastating in its implications. They would compare Bob Jr.'s DNA to that of his supposed cousin, the son of Bobby's younger brother Alonzo. The Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son. If Bob Jr. and Alonzo's son were really first cousins, their DNA would match. Margaret waited for the results, certain they would confirm what she'd been told her entire life. The phone call came faster than expected. The lab assistant's voice was matter-of-fact, almost casual, as if she didn't understand the magnitude of what she was about to say. The DNA didn't match. Bob Dunbar Jr. was not related to the Dunbar family at all. The man who had lived his entire life as Bobby Dunbar was not Bobby Dunbar. After 92 years, the truth was finally revealed. Julia Anderson had been right all along. The boy was Bruce, her son. The child the Dunbars had taken and raised as their own. The revelation shattered both families in different ways. For Julia Anderson's descendants, it was a painful vindication. Their grandmother, who had been dismissed as negligent and morally questionable, had been telling the truth. She had lost her son not through any fault of her own, but because a legal system had valued wealth and respectability over truth. For the Dunbar family, the discovery was devastating. Some family members embraced the truth, grateful to finally know. Others rejected it entirely, angry at Margaret for digging into the past, for destroying the family legend they cherished. The man they had loved and called Bobby was not biologically theirs, but he had been family in every way that mattered. He had grown up with them, shared their name, raised his children as Dunbars. Did DNA really change that? Margaret Dunbar Cutright called the results a heartbreak for both families. She eventually co-wrote a book about the case called A Case for Solomon, working with journalist Tal McThenia. In 2008, This American Life featured the story in a radio documentary called The Ghost of Bobby Dunbar. The most haunting part of the DNA revelation wasn't just that the wrong child had been raised by the Dunbars. It was the question that could never be answered: what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? Margaret Dunbar Cutright believes he drowned in Swayze Lake that August day in 1912, probably falling into the water and being killed by alligators. His body never recovered. It's the simplest explanation, the one that makes the most sense given the initial search and the location of his disappearance. But some researchers have suggested darker possibilities. Did the Dunbars, either accidentally or deliberately, have something to do with Bobby's disappearance? Did they use the Mississippi boy to cover up whatever happened at the lake? There's no evidence to support these theories, but once the foundation of trust is shattered, every possibility becomes suspect. In 2008, Julia Anderson's children recounted something strange. Two of them, Hollis and his sister Jules, claimed that a man they believed was Bruce Anderson, living as Bobby Dunbar, had visited them separately in the 1940s. Hollis said the man came to his place of business and they talked. Jules had a similar experience at the service station where she worked. The Dunbar family had their own version of this story. In 1963, while driving through Mississippi, the man known as Bobby Dunbar pointed to Poplarville and said to his family, "Those are the people they came to pick me up from." If these accounts are true, it suggests that the boy never forgot his origins entirely. Somewhere in his mind, buried beneath decades of being told he was Bobby Dunbar, Bruce Anderson remembered who he really was. And at some point, he went looking for the family that had been taken from him. Whether he ever found peace with that knowledge, we'll never know. The case of Bobby Dunbar is not a story with a villain. It's a tragedy of circumstance, of social inequality, of a time when wealth and respectability could outweigh truth in a courtroom. Julia Anderson wasn't a bad mother. The Dunbars weren't evil people intentionally stealing a child. William Walters wasn't a kidnapper. They were all victims of a system that valued the wrong things. But the greatest victim in this story was the boy himself, whoever he was. Bruce Anderson, raised as Bobby Dunbar, lived his entire life in the shadow of someone else's identity. He never knew his real family. He never had the choice to discover who he truly was. And Bobby Dunbar, the real Bobby Dunbar, disappeared into the swamps of Louisiana and was never found. His fate remains unknown, his story unfinished. 2 boys, 2 families, one terrible mistake that echoed through a century. The DNA test in 2004 answered one question but left another forever unanswered. We know now who came home that day in 1913. But we will never know what happened to the little boy with the light hair and blue eyes who wandered away from a family fishing trip in August of 1912. His ghost still haunts Swayze Lake, a reminder that sometimes the stories we tell ourselves are more comforting than the truth. But the truth has a way of emerging, even after 100 years. The mystery of Bobby Dunbar's disappearance may never be fully solved, but his case serves as a haunting reminder. Identity is everything, and taking it from someone, intentionally or not, is a theft that echoes through generations. Thank you so much for staying with us through this entire haunting journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Bobby Dunbar case, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another mysterious true crime story. What do you think happened to the real Bobby Dunbar? Do you believe he drowned in the lake? Or is there another explanation? Share your theories in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the past is never as simple as the stories we tell ourselves.